A country shaped like a dragon's spine, squeezed between mountains and sea, became the place where the world's most powerful military machine met its limits. How did a narrow strip of land, barely 50 kilometers wide at its thinnest point, humble the United States and reshape the balance of the entire Cold War? To understand that, we have to start not with a war, but with a shape on the map. Vietnam stretches nearly 1,600 kilometers from the mountainous border with China in the north down to the flat, waterlogged delta of the Mekong in the south. To the west, the Annamite Range runs almost the entire length of the country like a spine, separating Vietnam from Laos and Cambodia. This mountain range would later become one of the most consequential pieces of terrain in modern military history. To the east, the long coastline faces the South China Sea, a coastline that offered ports, but also exposed every city to attack from the water. This geography split the country into two natural halves long before any war ever did. The Red River Delta in the north, centered on Hanoi, and the Mekong Delta in the south, centered on Saigon. Between them, a narrow, mountainous waste of land near the 17th parallel would one day become the most fought-over line on Earth. But before there was a war between North and South, there was a war for control of the whole country. In the late 1800s, France carved out an empire in Southeast Asia, combining Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia into a single colonial territory called French Indochina. Paris wanted the rice of the Mekong Delta, the coal of the north, the rubber plantations spreading across the highlands. For decades, French administrators ruled from Hanoi, extracting resources while Vietnamese peasants worked the land they no longer controlled. Resentment simmered for generations. It needed only a spark. That spark came from the collapse of French power itself. In 1940, France fell to Nazi Germany, and its colonial government in Indochina, cut off from Paris, capitulated to Japan without a real fight. For the first time, Vietnamese nationalists saw the colonial master exposed as weak. Japanese forces occupied the ports and cities, but allowed the French administration to continue as a puppet, a strange arrangement that left ordinary Vietnamese ruled by two foreign powers at once. Into this chaos stepped a quiet, patient revolutionary named Ho Chi Minh. He had spent decades abroad, in Paris, Moscow, and southern China, absorbing communist ideology and refining a singular goal: Vietnamese independence. In 1941, from a cave near the Chinese border in the far north, he founded the Viet Minh, a nationalist front designed to fight for that independence, first against Japan and later against whoever else stood in the way. The location mattered. That border region, rugged and remote, gave the Viet Minh sanctuary and supply lines running north into communist-controlled China, a pattern of using difficult terrain and friendly neighbors that would define Vietnamese warfare for the next 3 decades. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, a power vacuum opened across Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh moved fast. In what became known as the August Revolution, Viet Minh forces swept into Hanoi, and within days, he stood before a crowd and declared Vietnamese independence, quoting language borrowed deliberately from the American Declaration of Independence. It was a bold appeal to Washington, a hope that the United States, having just fought a war against empires, might support the end of France's empire too. That hope would not survive contact with the Cold War. France had no intention of giving up its colony. By late 1946, French troops returned in force, determined to reassert control, and the First Indochina War began. This was not a war of clean front lines. French forces held the cities and the river deltas, where their firepower and mobility gave them the advantage. The Viet Minh instead melted into the countryside and the mountains, adopting guerrilla tactics: strike fast, vanish into the jungle, let the terrain absorb the counterattack. Years of grinding, inconclusive fighting spread from the Red River Delta down through the Central Highlands. Then, in 1954, the war moved to a remote valley the French thought they controlled completely. Dien Bien Phu sat deep in the mountainous northwest, near the Laotian border, chosen by French commanders because they believed its surrounding high ground was too difficult for the Viet Minh to bring artillery through. They were catastrophically wrong. Viet Minh forces, under General Vo Nguyen Giap, disassembled heavy artillery pieces, carried them by hand and bicycle through jungle trails over the mountains, and reassembled them on the ridgelines overlooking the French base below. For nearly 2 months, French forces were pounded from above, cut off, and slowly strangled. When Dien Bien Phu fell in May 1954, it wasn't just a military defeat, it was the end of French colonial power in Asia. Weeks later, diplomats gathered in Geneva to decide what came next, and this is where the map of Vietnam was redrawn in a way that would haunt the next 20 years. The country was split at the 17th parallel, a line running through the narrow waist of the country near the Ben Hai River, meant only as a temporary military boundary until national elections could reunify the country in 1956. North of that line, Ho Chi Minh's communist government took power from Hanoi. South of it, a new anti-communist government formed around Saigon, deep in the Mekong Delta region. The elections never happened. Washington and Saigon feared, correctly, that Ho Chi Minh would win a national vote outright. The temporary line became a permanent border, and Vietnam had, in effect, become 2 countries. Why did the United States care so much about this narrow strip of land, 9,000 kilometers from its own shores? The answer was a strategic idea called the domino theory. American policymakers believed that if South Vietnam fell to communism, neighboring Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and eventually all of Southeast Asia would topple in sequence, like dominoes, extending Soviet and Chinese influence across the entire region. Vietnam wasn't the prize. It was the first domino, and Washington decided it could not be allowed to fall. To prevent that, the United States backed a South Vietnamese leader named Ngo Dinh Diem, a devout Catholic in a majority Buddhist country who ruled from Saigon with increasing authoritarianism. American advisors arrived through the late 1950s in growing numbers, training South Vietnamese forces, building infrastructure, propping up a government that was, underneath the surface, deeply unpopular. Meanwhile, in the countryside, a new insurgent movement was forming, the Viet Cong, Southern Communist guerrillas directed and supplied from Hanoi, blending into villages across the Mekong Delta and the Central Highlands, indistinguishable from the farmers around them. By 1964, the United States needed a reason to escalate from advising to fighting outright, and it arrived off the coast of North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin, where American destroyers reported attacks by North Vietnamese patrol boats. The details were murky, and later evidence suggested the second attack may never have happened at all. But murky or not, Congress used it to pass a resolution granting the president sweeping authority to wage war in Vietnam without a formal declaration. The dominoes were now Washington's problem to stop, directly. The bombing campaign that followed, Operation Rolling Thunder, unleashed American air power across North Vietnam starting in 1965, targeting supply depots, bridges, and infrastructure from Hanoi down through the Panhandle toward the 17th parallel. The goal was to break North Vietnam's will and cut off its ability to supply the war in the South. It failed on both counts. Bombing alone could not sever a supply network that didn't run through a single choke point. It ran through the mountains. That network was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and it may be the single most important piece of geography in the entire war. Rather than moving supplies straight south through the heavily bombed and heavily defended 17th parallel, North Vietnam routed men and material west into the Annamite Mountains, then south through the jungles of eastern Laos and Cambodia, re-entering South Vietnam far from the border the Americans were watching. It was not one road, but a sprawling web of trails, river crossings, and hidden depots, constantly rebuilt, constantly rerouted, running the entire length of the country just beyond the reach of South Vietnamese sovereignty. American bombs fell on Laos and Cambodia by the hundreds of thousands trying to sever this trail. It never fully worked. The jungle canopy hid movement from the air, and the trail simply grew new branches where old ones were destroyed. On the ground inside South Vietnam, the Viet Cong built an entirely different kind of geography, one underground. Near Cu Chi, northwest of Saigon, Guerrillas dug tunnel networks stretching for hundreds of kilometers, complete with hospitals, kitchens, and barracks, allowing fighters to disappear beneath villages that American and South Vietnamese forces had supposedly secured just hours earlier. This was the essence of the war for American troops, a jungle that offered no clear front line, where the enemy could be anywhere and often was underneath their feet. To strip away the cover the jungle provided, American forces turned to chemical warfare. Napalm, a jellied incendiary, was dropped to burn through vegetation and expose hidden positions, while Agent Orange, a herbicide, was sprayed across millions of hectares of forest and farmland to destroy the canopy the Ho Chi Minh Trail and Viet Cong strongholds depended on. The environmental and human cost of Agent Orange would linger in Vietnamese soil and in the bodies of exposed soldiers and civilians for generations, a consequence that outlasted the war itself by decades. By early 1968, American commanders were telling the public that North Vietnam was running out of options, that the war was being won through attrition. Then came the Tet Offensive. Timed to the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched a coordinated, simultaneous assault on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, from the old imperial capital of Hue in the north down to Saigon itself, where fighters briefly breached the grounds of the American embassy. Militarily, Tet was a disaster for the communists. Their forces were exposed, engaged directly, and devastated by American and South Vietnamese firepower in the fighting that followed. But the offensive answered a question millions of Americans back home had been asking with growing suspicion. If the enemy could strike the capital and the embassy itself, how close to victory could the war really be? Tet did not defeat the United States on the battlefield. It defeated the argument that the war was almost won. The war's brutality came home again in early 1968 when American soldiers entered the hamlet of My Lai in the coastal lowlands and killed hundreds of unarmed civilians, an atrocity covered up for over a year before investigative journalism forced it into public view. Coming so soon after Tet, the massacre shattered any remaining illusion of a clean, contained war and fueled an anti-war movement that had already been growing on American college campuses and city streets. Protests swelled into the hundreds of thousands. The war was no longer just being fought in the jungles of Vietnam. It was being fought in the politics of Washington. Nixon inherited a war he needed to end without appearing to lose it, and his strategy took two forms, one visible and one hidden. Publicly, he pursued Vietnamization, a plan to gradually withdraw American ground troops while transferring the burden of combat to South Vietnamese forces, backed by American air power and funding. Privately, he expanded the war's geography rather than shrinking it, authorizing secret bombing campaigns and ground incursions into neutral Cambodia and Laos in 1969 and 1970, aiming to destroy North Vietnamese sanctuaries and sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail once and for all. Instead, the bombing helped destabilize Cambodia's government and created the conditions for the rise of the Khmer Rouge, a catastrophe whose full horror would unfold only after American forces had left the region entirely. By 1973, exhausted by casualties, cost, and collapsing public support, the United States signed the Paris Peace Accords with North Vietnam, agreeing to withdraw all remaining American forces in exchange for a ceasefire. Crucially, the accords allowed North Vietnamese troops to remain exactly where they were, inside South Vietnamese territory. It was a peace agreement that left the map fundamentally unresolved, a pause rather than a resolution. The pause did not last. Just 2 years later, in early 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a rapid offensive south, and without American air power or ground support, South Vietnamese defenses collapsed astonishingly fast. City after city fell in a matter of weeks, the Central Highlands, then Hue, then Da Nang along the coast, the front line sliding southward almost as quickly as it could be drawn on a map. By late April, North Vietnamese tanks were rolling into Saigon itself, crashing through the gates of the presidential palace on April 30th, 1975. The fall of Saigon, broadcast around the world through images of desperate evacuations from rooftops by helicopter, marked the end of South Vietnam as a country and the reunification of Vietnam under a single communist government, the very outcome Washington had spent 2 decades and enormous resources trying to prevent. The human cost was staggering by any measure. An estimated 1 to 2 million Vietnamese civilians died, alongside hundreds of thousands of North and South Vietnamese soldiers, and more than 58,000 American service members, a toll that reshaped families and politics on every side of the conflict for a generation. The war left Vietnam poisoned by Agent Orange, cratered by bombing, and economically devastated for years afterward, even in victory. Politically, the war fractured American confidence in its own government and military, feeding a lasting skepticism about foreign intervention that would shape debates over war for decades to come. Globally, it proved that the domino theory's simple logic didn't always hold. Southeast Asia did not fall to communism in a chain reaction the way Washington had feared, and within years, Vietnam itself would find itself in conflict with communist neighbors rather than allied with them. The Cold War's map, it turned out, was far more complicated than the dominoes suggested. Vietnam's shape on the map, that long dragon spine running from the mountains near China down to the delta near the sea, made this war almost impossible to win the way conventional militaries were built to fight. There was no single line to hold, no single trail to cut, no single capital whose capture would end the resistance. The jungle, the mountains, and the rivers weren't just a backdrop to this war. They were, in many ways, the reason it turned out the way it did, and the reason a small country in Southeast Asia forced the most powerful military in the world to confront the limits of its own power.